Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. It's when giving a talk on these Wednesday evenings, try to mix things up as best I possibly can to give a bit of variety. And last night at Armadale, at the question time after meditation, we just got into talking about reincarnation. And one of the people there told me an interesting story, which is nice to share with you, and just see if you can weave a talk about sort of the idea of rebirth or reincarnation. And I know that every now and again when I mention the word reincarnation, some people pick me up and say you should say rebirth because there's a difference there. And I think that's just being very picky. From the times when I started reading the sutras in Pali, you see just the way that the Buddha used those words. He used the words and it's basically his average meaning by the people who were listening to him. And most people you talk to in countries like Australia, they just don't know. They're not sort of subtle enough to notice the theological difference between reincarnation and rebirth. So you might as well use the word reincarnation because it's the word they remember. But anyway, that one of the regulars over at Armadale, they sort of wanted to interject because I had a story the last week, a fascinating one, that their friend was going to a shop, and I don't know what the shop is. She's called it the fairy shop. I don't know what a fairy shop is, but there must be some fairy shop. But anyway, she took her 2-year-old son into the shop and bought some stuff. And then when they got back home, the 2-year-old said, I want to go back to see my wife. That was my wife in the shop. And apparently the 2-year-old got into such a sort of a state that, just was not going to let this go, demanded to go back to the shop to see his wife. And so they went back into the shop because the mother was just a bit fascinated, but also to keep the child quiet, went back into that fairy shop, and he went straight up to this old lady, put his hands around her, and she said to him, I knew you'd come back, because she could recognize him, apparently. And so it was really quite a moving experience, this little 2-year-old and this, 70-year-old woman, sort of hugging, husband and wife. And then sort of happily they went home. And I think the woman said to the little 2-year-old, I'm going to be going soon. In other words, I'm going to die soon. So she was obviously some sort of spiritual person or whatever. But when he went home, the little boy couldn't remember anything of it, which was really quite fascinating addition to that story. And didn't know, what are you talking about? That's not I don't know what you're talking about, the little boy said. So it's fascinating there, but every now and again you just have these little stories which come up, which people tell you, and there's no reason why people would lie or bend the truth on these things, that there is such a thing as rebirth and reincarnation, and it's one of the great insights which come up after meditation. I know that sometimes we talk about insight practice, and sometimes we don't mention the fact that that is one of the Tewija, the 3 great, you might as well call them insights, the 3 knowledges which come up as a result of deep meditation. And in some of those Buddhist similes, he called it, that's the first cracking of the egg, when there's a little chick who's hatching from the egg, that first crack of the egg, and the second crack of the egg when it can put its beak out, and the third crack of the egg when it can actually walk out, so it's escaped. And that's how the Buddha described these 3 sequential insights which come up after very deep meditation. The knowledge of rebirth or reincarnation is the first cracking the egg, and the second sort of cracking of the egg is understanding, once you understand the huge problem of rebirth in samsara with many, many births, is the law of karma, understanding that in the context of many lives. And lastly, understanding the 4 Noble Truths and stepping out of the egg as an enlightened being. But that whole idea of reincarnation or rebirth is such a central idea, in Buddhism, and sometimes you get quite surprised and quite so disappointed that some people say it's not necessary, or it's unscientific, it hasn't been proved. And there's heaps and heaps of evidence out there. If somebody really wants to look at the evidence, it's out there. And you can sort of prove it for yourself. But of course, it's the nature of human beings. If they don't want to see something, they will not see it. It's that part of delusion, avijja, the core reason why people keep getting reborn and keep suffering. And it's such a tough one to break, because sometimes we just don't want to be wise. We don't want to see what's really there. And you've heard me talk before about these vipalasas, the way that our sort of defilements actually bend the truth, even actually filter out what comes into our perceptions, let alone the way we think about our perceptions. It actually bends all these things to suit our views. It's one of the most difficult things about becoming wise, that our views, what we understand is the nature of the world, what Buddhism is, what everything else is, that actually bends our perceptions. We filter out what challenges our views, and we base all our thinking on these perceptions, and we make up this argument which just proves what we wanted to prove anyway, our views. And it's such a sort of a terrible, vicious circle, always self-reinforcing our ignorance and our delusion. It's a tough one to break out of. And so there is, many people would say, no, there's no such thing as reincarnation. Even if when they die and they get reborn, they'd probably be in denial, saying, no, this is not true, it's not happened to me, I'm just dreaming this. But no, such a thing does exist. And the nice thing of actually understanding that is to use one's power of deep meditation, and to actually have a state of mind where that vipalasa, that perversion of your perceptual and cognitive faculties, is undermined through the abandoning of the 5 hindrances. So our practice in this monastery, if we want to be wise and break all these delusions, is actually to overcome these 5 hindrances. That's almost like a core practice we should be looking at. And you all know those 5 hindrances. It's the desire and ill will, the first 2. They're obvious ways that they bend the truth to suit us. The desire means we just see and we hear, we know what we want to know. And the ill will causes denial. What we hate knowing, we will refuse to know. Remember that sort of psychology experiment which was done in Harvard some years ago. It was a very good experiment. Please excuse me, those people have heard my talk so many times. There's only a certain number of similes and articles which I've read in my life. And the number of talks I have to give far outnumber sort of the stories and similes. So they always will have to be repeated. But if any of you ever listen or read the sutras of the Buddha, you see he did the same, so I'm in good company. So that particular experiment which was done at Harvard was to take some students into a movie theatre, and there were flashing images on a screen. And the images were flashed so fast, it was hard to know what the image was portraying. And they had a pad and pen where they would write down what they thought the image was. And then the exposure on the screen was increased incrementally. So as they saw the image for longer, they obviously had more information and they could maybe guess what it was. And they kept on extending, or rather increasing the exposure time. And so they would see, at what particular time they could get the image right. And one of the things which they found was that once you've made up your mind what that image was, that stops you seeing it in any other way. The example I remember from reading the article in the Psychology mag was that they thought that what the image was a ship on the sea, and actually it was just the stairs going into one of the main faculty buildings at Harvard. But they thought it was a ship, and because they thought it was a ship, they had the view it's a ship. That view was formed early on. That was so dominant they could not change that view. even though the exposure was so long that a person seeing it for the first time would easily recognize it as one of the major buildings in the campus of Harvard. What they were proving there is once you have a particular view, a particular way of seeing things, that will stop you seeing things in a different way. That view does stop other perceptions, and it does inform the way you think about the data which you have. But the other thing which was interesting from that piece of that experiment was the one image which the students found the longest time to get right was two dogs copulating. And the reason was because they decided that was so distasteful that they would see it in other ways rather than seeing what was true because they didn't like the image which was really there. So you'd interpret it, you perceive it in so many different ways, anything but to see the truth, because the truth wasn't particularly nice. And that actually really shows that of desire and ill will, it's usually ill will is the hindrance which bends your perception and thoughts and ideas more than anything else. Even more so than just desire and craving. And you know that when people get into a bad mood, when they sort of get upset or they get angry. It's amazing just how they see the world. And it's just so hard to break out of that. So of all of the hindrances, perhaps that ill will is one of the most difficult to overcome and one of the biggest enemies. And that's one of the reasons why in a monastery you try your very best to create as much metta, loving kindness, even more metta and loving kindness, even at the expense of indulgence of the senses. Because the ill will and the hatred is more dangerous. It just bends perceptions even more than desire does. And that was the result of that little experiment which was done in Harvard. But of course one has to overcome both of those. The ill will, which stops you seeing the truth, even if it's unpleasant, to find out you were wrong, or life isn't exactly as you expected it to be, or life is actually quite, in a bit of a problem. That sort of denial, that ill will to facing up to the truth is one of the greatest ways where ignorance and delusion continues. And the same with desire. And so that actually applies to something like reincarnation. Sometimes I wondered why isn't in the West especially, are people so resistant to the idea of rebirth or reincarnation? Why don't they give it a fair chance? And it's, the evidence is there, and you can explain it to people, you can present it to people, but still people don't want to see it. And it's not really desire which is stopping them seeing it. I think it really is the ill will, especially the fear. When they know, my goodness, I have to come back again. And that prospect can be just so terrifying for some people in a very deep psychological way. So much so that they just don't want to even contemplate the idea of reincarnation. It's just too unpleasant for them. And of course in the Buddha's sutras that it's supposed to be unpleasant. The whole idea of seeing reincarnation is actually elaborating and fulfilling the first noble truth of suffering. It is true that once you understand reincarnation, you see just the problem you're in, the big problem, having to get reborn again. And you don't know where next time. Just one life is difficult and dangerous enough, and many of you have had pretty good lives. We just have to read the newspaper and see some places what they have to go through, and you think, my goodness, that could be me in my next life. So we have to get rid of those 5 hindrances, but I think the denial is one of the biggest ones, the ill will, and which is why we try and encourage metta, loving kindness, compassion as much as possible. And certainly that's what Ajahn Chah would always encourage his senior monks to do. And he told me, I remember him saying this, if ever you become a senior monk and abbot, please focus on metta more than anything else. Maybe that was the reason why. But of course the other hindrances which have to be overcome to see things like the truth of reincarnation and the truth of anything is actually to be still enough so you have long enough time to gather the information. When you're really restless, you don't spend enough time on anything. And that's why then if you're doing some chanting, learning some chanting, give it the time so you can actually do it. And don't just learn a little chant and then go on to something else. If you're meditating, give it time, give it a lot of time, because if you're just restless, I'm talking about the big restless, you meditate now, and then you go and do something else, and then you decide to go and read, then you go and decide to learn Pali, and you never actually just go through the whole course of learning Pali, maybe 1 or 2 lessons, then you give it up. That's called restlessness. It's never giving things the time necessary for the results to actually come. It takes a while, it takes a lot of patience. Patience is, again, the opposite of restlessness. To be with something and to stay with it and not move. And of course, the way to create that sort of opposite of restlessness is to see the beauty and good in things. Again, the opposites of ill will. Very often I usually think that ill will is what creates restlessness. I've told many, many people the only reason why your mind isn't still is because you don't like being here. It's not so much you want to be somewhere else, it's just you don't like this. It's a negativity towards this moment that creates that restlessness, which means you can't sit still. And again, that negativity is very often overcome by just practicing a little bit more metta, a bit more loving kindness, a bit more opening the door of your heart to this moment, unconditionally, no matter what it feels like. You just allow this moment to be. And I've certainly practiced that. If ever my mind is restless, I usually check out loving kindness first of all. And now I've learned how to develop metta towards my breath, metta towards the present moment, metta towards the silent, metta towards anything. And there's no reason why you can't do that. The human being, especially the Westerner, can anthropomorphize. If you can love a car, if you can love sort of an inanimate being, surely you can love a concept or like a feeling such as a breath. You can anthropomorphize and just look at this breath with a sense of kindness and care like a friend. And that stops a lot of restlessness. And obviously the dullness, you've talked so much about dullness. All that is you've been working too hard and you just need to rest a bit more. And then the dullness disappears. If you have been resting a lot and you're still dull, that just means boredom. You're not putting enough interest into what you're doing. You don't really value it enough. You don't see the purpose in it. And sometimes seeing the problem which you're facing, the problem that we do have this terrible thing called rebirth in front of us, and we don't know where we're going to get reborn next, that should be enough of incentive to realize the importance of what you're doing in this monastery, so you don't waste time. So I'm not making you tense, but just overcoming that laziness which can sometimes happen in a monastery which is built for hermits, where you're given the time to be by yourself. So, the last one obviously is doubt, and that's my job as a teacher to try and understand what is these things, how they come, and what their purpose is, and how to overcome them. But again, the main thing is that why is it that sort of people can't understand these reincarnations? Why don't they give it a chance? And I think mostly because underneath they do realize sort of the problem it faces if reincarnation happens to be true. Having to go through all this over again, building another monastery, just because we did a fire drill this afternoon. That's what happened when we had a big fire in 91, in January the 31st. A huge fire, and we were asked to evacuate, and so we all left this monastery, and as you left this monastery, it was burning. Real big fire, crown fire. That means the whole trees, and the flames shooting up twice the height of trees. That's a huge flames, and you saw that, and it was just amazing. It really was awesome in the true sense of that word, not in the modern sense, but in the true sense. Just the power of nature. But you had to evacuate, otherwise, you'd probably have died. And evacuating from this monastery, and that was 91, I came here in 83. That was 8 years, and I did most of the work in this monastery, especially in those years. Built everything. And those of you who have just been taking down the guest house, that was one of my buildings which I put up. So you just see how much work went into that. And it was all burning. And it was a very great test to see that, all that work is all going to disappear. The whole lot's going to burn down. And we really thought it was going to burn down, and you could let it go. You went down to the Southwest Highway where the evacuation point was, the police and the emergency services. They offered me a sandwich, but it was the middle of the night, you can't take anything. Could have really done with one after you've been working really, really hard. And then we went to a shearer's shed to try and have a couple of hours sleep. And then back in the morning, and surprised, incredibly surprised that the monastery was still there. I remember coming up Kingsbury Drive and just there was no wall all the way down then, so you could see right into the monastery. You see these gleaming steel roofs all over the place because the forest, all the leaves were gone. You could see right into the monastery. Actually no privacy whatsoever. It was just charred trunks but gleaming steel roofs. The monastery was saved. But the one thing which I didn't fancy doing was another 8 years of hard work. And I looked at that, and you can let it go, but gee, we've got to start all over again. All that hard work which you did, and all that sweat, and it really was tough work. I'm not just saying this another good old days talk, it really was tough. And to do all that all over again, were you ready for that? Basically the answer was no. And I thought about, that's just like reincarnation as well. It's so hard just getting this far in your life, struggling so much, and do you want to do it all over again? And the answer obviously is no. And that's a pretty good life, being born in a Western country just with enough, well actually not enough, but surplus wealth so you can go on holidays and do all these amazing things and get all these gadgets. But I've been around and seeing some people born in very, very poor states, and is that going to be me next time? Maybe next time you're not so lucky. You've been in hospitals, you've been at funeral services. You see, I've seen enough in my life of when life goes wrong. And just, you used to say, just as before I became a Buddhist, there for good fortune go you or I. And just sometimes you wonder just when's your fortune going to run out? When's that going to happen to you? So just seeing the big picture of rebirth, it's actually scary if you contemplate it. And that's the whole point of it. Actually to see that, when you understand that rebirth is a fact and you get born again and again and again and again and again, that is the biggest suffering you could possibly imagine. Just the whole uncertainty of it and having to go through this torture and this pain and even like death. Even in the Western world, again, visited old people's homes, visited ICU units, visited wars where people are dying. It's not a pleasant thing. Even in a country like Australia, a city like Perth with excellent health care, I've been sitting next to people who are gasping for breath for 2 or 3 days, no sleep, just waiting to die. I've been told you people in the dementia ward who every moment are in terror. And these are actually the good people, not even the people who have constant pain when they are coming into the emergency wards, with their legs hanging off. You've seen people like that screaming in the emergency ward. I remember taking one lady there to try and get her admitted because she had just taken a knife to her mother-in-law and cut her up. And she was obviously mad and just taken her into the emergency ward, and other people were screaming in pain. It was like going into a hell realm. That was the emergency room of Sir Charles Gardner Hospital. I don't know what had happened there because the rooms were curtained off. But before the triage nurses or other people actually could get to them and give them an injection, they were just screaming. And that woman I took in there just wanted to run out straight away. I can imagine what she was feeling. Are they going to do this to me? It's a very scary place sometimes. And that's first world country. I don't know what happens in the third world countries. But sometimes it becomes quite scary. And that's the reason why it's good to keep contemplating this. And to keep understanding that, as Buddhists commonly say, you have had the great good fortune to get a human rebirth. That is a great piece of good luck. You have had the great good fortune to come across the Dhamma. And now many of you had the great good fortune to be monks, novices, anagarikas in a monastery where you're well supported, when you can actually do something about this problem and stop getting reborn. That idea of actually valuing the incredibly lucky and fortunate situation you are in is something which maybe we don't talk enough about. And sometimes people just throw this away too easy. They just go, say, it doesn't matter, I can practice outside. And they just disrobe. They just get caught up in that world. And the opportunity to do an escape from rebirth is just diminished immensely. And I'm not just saying this just to keep you here. I'm just saying this because this is what you read in the sutras. This is how the Buddha taught. It's a valuable opportunity, so don't waste it. The days and nights are relentlessly passing, as the Buddha said. How well are you spending your time? The years go by, the rains go by. Many of you look back when you first came into this monastery, when you first became a novice, it was just like yesterday. Now how many years have gone by? How well have you spent that time? It gives you a sense of urgency. Because death is coming, one day you'll die, and how soon it will be you don't know, and then what? And that's the problem, then what? And what the meditation does, it just actually lets you face up to that truth, even though a lot of people are in denial about it, because it's quite scary and painful to contemplate. But once you actually face up to it, then you can say, well, this is the truth, and what can I do about it? And that's when, through meditation, you can actually find out the process of rebirth. This happens, but how does it happen? Because you can't sort of mend the problem until you find out exactly how the problem sort of arises. And that's actually one of the great benefits of the deep meditations. Because they don't just show you that rebirth actually is a fact, it's very obvious to you in the deep meditations, but you get to understand just what propels this body-mind process from moment to moment. What keeps it going? And when you get into those deep, still meditations and everything is so still, you see things vanish and stop. And you understand afterwards, when you come out, things get going again. You can actually see the process, what the Buddha called the house builder. It's a very good little simile which the Buddha said. He said the house builder keeps on building these huts, and that is your bodies, in which this mind keeps on living. And that house builder is craving, its will, its desire. You see it. It's what makes you move, what agitates you, what stops you being still. That's the house builder. And you can see that very clearly as you get into the very, very deep meditations when things stop and you're very, very still. You can understand very clearly just how samsara stops. Now you create the world with your will. Now you're the one who makes karma with your intentions, with your cravings. And it's that karma, that will, the sankhara and the karma, which keeps this whole process going around and around and around. Yeah, it's dependent origination, paticca samuppada, if you really want to go into it in detail. But you can see it very clearly, very easily, that when the mind moves, it creates the next moment. When it's still, in the deep meditations, there is no next moment. It's just in this moment, and everything starts to unravel, unwind, and fall apart, and stop. It becomes very, very clear what you need to do at the end of your life, just after your death, if you want to stop being reborn. You have to be still, so nothing moves. There's no intention, no will. And if you're that still, there's actually nothing to propel this mind process into another birth. But just one little movement of your mind, one little intention, one little blip on the screen, and then you end up in another womb again, having to do it all over again. I like that idea of stillness as being the way you exit from samsara, because that really shows me even in this life I have to perfect my stillness. Keep perfecting it as a skill which I'll make the most use of in that moment when I die and just afterwards. To make sure that I can sit down in my cave, in a hut, wherever I happen to be, and just stop doing things, and stop craving, and stop wanting, and stop all this agitation which keeps my mind going through this life, and which will take my mind into another body in another life. I don't know about you, but I've had enough. I've seen enough in my life and other lives to actually to know. Just, there is no real satisfaction there. I still remember some of these old stories and metaphors from our Western culture. You got that thing called Groundhog Day. Guy always waking up this morning. When he goes to bed at night, he wakes up this morning. Just this loop, always reliving the same day, and just driving him out of his mind. It was a wonderful metaphor for, reincarnation. Because, maybe your life in the next life is slightly different, but it's basically all the same. And after a while, it's incredible boredom. And the other metaphor I remember from my youth is this movie, a Dracula movie. But it was, at the time, I remember seeing the review afterwards. It was called The Thinking Man's Dracula. Simply because it wasn't just, for horror. It had a very deep message, which I took away with me after seeing it. And it was this Dracula had lived for about 400 years. I was just totally at his wit's end. Did not want to live another day. After 400 years, you've had enough. But the only way that he could die was being lured out of the darkness into the sunlight. If the rays of the sun fell on him, then he would die. And in the end, he was fighting his fear of death with his loathing of life. And eventually the loathing of life won, and he allowed himself to be tempted out into the rising sun at dawn, and he passed away. And that was a wonderful metaphor for me, because after a while, when you've been there and done that so many times, what more do you want to do? Haven't you had enough? And this is that nibbida which the Buddha was talking about. And it was actually seeing what the real problem was and realizing it's about time to get out of here. I've had enough. And if you don't see that problem, then sometimes you don't have the motivation, which is why I'm talking about reincarnation. It's not just death, it's like reincarnation, what happens afterwards. Death is only just a couple of days of pain. When you realize you have to keep on doing that again and again and again, and all of the difficulties and pain in between, it changes the whole purpose of your life. I know that people used to ask me, you monks, you're just into escaping. And I said, at last someone understands. Yes, we are. If you were in prison and realized you were in prison and realized what was happening, you would try and escape too. It's obvious, it's wise, it's compassion. You escape and take as many people with you. And that's the whole purpose of our life. So we want to try and escape from samsara, but first of all we have to notice it is actually a problem. And just ask yourself, where am I going to be reborn next? And you ask yourself that question. And is it going to be any better than this? This particular monastery, this particular place, it may not be the best monastery in the whole of the world right now, but it's up there with some of the best of them. You've got huge amounts of time, you've got great support, you've got your own little huts, you've got time there to practice, to meditate, to study. So don't waste the time when you've got it here. Understand reincarnation. And understand, once you can actually see through deep meditation how that rebirth process actually happens, you see that very clearly. You can see just when the mind first moves after you've been in a deep meditation. And you're back in the world again, you're creating this world again. You keep it still and the world disappears. And just even small things, you just sit in your hut and you just aren't so agitated. The world outside, your family, your friends, the movies, everything else, that all disappears. But when you start moving, it's amazing the sort of world you create. And you create a complicated world the more you move. And the longer you live, the more complicated that world becomes. It's very easy to live a simple life when you're young. But the older you get, the more complex it becomes. Simply because you've just been creating this web and you just keep on creating more and more things. Just like as your possessions grow as you get older, so do your complications as well. So be careful. See if you can just simplify and go in the opposite direction to most other people. Be more peaceful, more still, and let go of things rather than gaining more things. And see if you can make an end of this life. It's one of Ajahn Chah's favourite sayings. He said he always wanted to make an end of things, not to make more things. You know what it's like sometimes. How many more buildings do you have to put up, Ajahn Brahmali? Is he going to spend your whole life building things? You finish this monastery and then they send you over to Norway to build another monastery. How many more talks do I have to give? Is it always just another talk? How many more meals do you have to eat? And after a while it gives you this beautiful sense of what the French called ennui. That's actually a very beautiful translation for nibbida. Ennui, it's not just boredom, it's just, this is yucky, what am I getting into? You really want to find an escape. So not the deep meditations not only show you the problem and show you, yes, there is rebirth. It's very clear that this mind is independent of the body and its five senses. You can actually see that in the deep meditations. Your mind is separated. Your five senses are not there, and the body's not there. And you see that this mind, without those five senses, without a body, is self-sustaining. It can just live with itself. It doesn't need the five senses. It doesn't need the body. It's very, very clear in this deep meditations that that is a fact. So that by itself shows you that the mind doesn't need a body. The body disappears, body disappears, but the mind is still there. I'm not saying the mind is a self, this is a process. And so even the mind starts to disappear in those meditations, but at least you know that the fact there's rebirth is reincarnation, just from that fact, to see the independence of the citta from the body in the jhana states. And then to be able just to see, just as those jhana states fade away, just how the world gets created again. You know, they say that was in the Buddha's description of the creation of the world, or rather the first being. They're in the jhana realms, and they start to move, and they fall into this world, and they think they're the creator, because they're the firstborn. It's not that, because they moved, they created something. And you are the creator. And if you're not careful, you keep on creating things so much at the end of this life, you just create another life again. And another life, and another life. And don't think you're in such control you can create a much better life next time. You know what it's like when even you're just trying to create sort of a shelf, trying to build a shelf. Or you're laying bricks, or you're just creating a meal. It seems so simple just to create a delicious meal, but it's so difficult because sometimes things go wrong. It's not your fault, it's just the world, it just doesn't bend to your will. With all the best skill in the world and the best effort in the world, sometimes the bricks aren't straight. So if you think you can create a beautiful life next time, yeah, you'll try for it, but you'll fail. Because you're not in control. You make mistakes, you stuff up. So don't think that, okay, I'm not really afraid of rebirth because I'm skillful enough, I made enough good karma, I'm wise enough, I can make a good one next time. Many people think that, and they have a painful one. So see how the world is created, through this will and through the stupidity, and thereby there goes our generation of human beings and other beings as well. And the way out of that, to see just how you can stop the wheel. It's a beautiful thing of stopping a wheel. It's got to be still. You've got to find out where the engine is and turn that engine off so the wheel stops moving. There's no brake on it because the brake is willpower and it just doesn't work that way. You can't will it to stop. That's what the Buddha called vibhava-tanha, the craving to sort of destroy things or to stop things. That brake just makes things worse. So there's no brake on this wheel of samsara. There's actually finding its energy source and stopping that. That energy source is will, born of delusion. So that's why spent such a long time teaching just to really let go, make peace, be still. Because when you are still, that will has vanished. It's stopped for a while. That's why stillness is the goal of meditation. It's the freedom from craving, the freedom from will, the freedom from wanting. Temporarily, yes, but at least it gives you a taste of what it's like. Even this afternoon, just meditating in my cave, just meditating, and look, what I want, I never get. And my enemy is not disappointment. My enemy is just wanting in the first place. That was my enemy. So I looked at my mind in meditation, and it was the wanting which I focused on. And every time I saw a want come up, I'd stop it. I'd actually have no wanting. I'd settled still that wanting. That's why you get very peaceful. What do you want anyway? Whatever it is the object or the goal or the purpose of your wanting, you achieve that when you stop the wanting. It's counterintuitive, almost like reverse psychology, but that's true. You have all this wanting, all this striving, all this manipulating to try and get this sense of peace, happiness, contentment, this sense of fulfillment. But you never get that through wanting. You give up wanting, there you have your peace, your fulfillment, the sense of stillness and contentment. That's why the Buddha saw the wanting was the problem, the craving, the desire. And if you can stop the wanting, of course you're still. There's nothing to move you. And as that stillness develops more and more, you realize that this is how to end samsara. To develop and cultivate that stillness, to become a connoisseur of stillness, an expert in stillness. That stillness is the tools of your trade. It is what you know more than anything else. Stillness and how that stillness is generated. Until you can sit in your hut, your cave, and just not move. And if you can do that long enough, you'll know that that will be the way out of samsara. You can be so still at your death. There's no reason, there's no possibility of any movement, and everything fades away. Of course it begs the question why we can't be still, and that was the talk I gave last week, because there's a sense of me in there, a sense of self. You haven't overcome that delusion of an ego. Where there's an ego, a sense of self, you'll always do things, you'll complain, you'll have differences of opinion, and you'll sort of argue, you'll do things, you'll create, just because that's what a self does. Now the self is the person behind that will, or at least the illusion behind that will, which keeps it going on. That's why wherever there's a self, there is a doer. And you can actually attack the problem either way. Let go of the self, and then no doing becomes possible. Let go of the doer, and there's no sense of self. It's one of the reasons why in stillness it feels like you've disappeared. When nothing moves and you're in deep meditation, just you've gone. It's like you're not there anymore. Everything all those signs which described you, all those ideas, which characterize you, they've all vanished. And you've got nothing to hang a hat on, no peg to hang a label of who you think you are, of those deep states of stillness. Everything is gone. And that's why one of the clear descriptions, the inner descriptions of people who experience the deep states, what it feels like is selfless. You're not there anymore, you're gone. At least what you thought you were, and all of your identity tags are all disappeared in the deep meditations. That's why stillness can happen. The two go together. No self and no doing. Stillness and emptiness go together. And if you want to have no rebirth, the stillness and the non-self, nothing to get reborn, nothing to do. You don't get the wheel moving anymore. For you, samsara stops, and it stops once and for all. which means there's no more rebirth, no reincarnation. And as the Buddha said, look, if there was no reincarnation, there'd be no point to this holy life. When you die, we're all the same anyway, so what's the point? But because there is rebirth, because there is a life after this one for you, that's why you should be terrified. What might happen next? Maybe terrified, maybe a bit too strong a word. But at least you should be concerned. Concerned enough not to put forth this effort and create more doing, but concerned enough to start doing this practice properly, to let go, to renounce, to spend time sitting by yourself, letting things go, letting go of all these fantasies and dreams and plans and messing around, which is just wasting time. You know it's wasting time. Because who knows the day you're going to die. So make sure that you don't waste this time. It's very easy to meditate when you just know how to let go. When you let go of this self business and you don't do anything, you just sit there and allow things to settle down by themselves. But learn that technique, learn that skill as soon as you can. It gives you an incredible sense of happiness and peace in this life. As the Buddha said, it's a pleasant abiding here and now. Not only that, it shows you just that reincarnation or rebirth is a fact which you can't ignore. It tells you it is a problem, and a problem which you have to solve. You just can't just hide under the carpet. And it's also a problem with a solution. And that solution is stillness, letting go of craving. So that this is your last life, and you know it's your last life. The seed has been destroyed. The self which creates the craving, or rather the delusion which creates the craving. That's why reincarnation is central to this path. And if you don't believe it, again, just stop messing around, get into some meditation. Ask yourself, what's my earliest memory, and find out that, yeah, you have lived before. Look at all the evidence. Yes, other people have lived before, it's quite clear. And then just use your intelligence. If other people have lived before and I'm going to live again, gee, where am I going to be next time? Better get my act together in this life while there is still time. So that's the talk this evening on reincarnation. Andamaya Mawarakataya Sarukam the Dhamma